History International Viking event that we run annually with the Norwegian Royal Embassy in Ireland and with our partners, the National University of Ireland in Dublin. And I'm here on behalf not just of myself, but of my colleague Emma Purcell, historian in NUI, and unfortunately Emma, who's done a huge amount of work on this festival every year with me, is not able to join us due to just an illness. So unfortunately she's not here, but I know that she's probably live streaming. So hello, Emma. And thank you for all your hard work. So before we kick off with our seminar, I just have to run through a few safety announcements first. You're in the Woodkey venue, and the fire evacuation procedure is as follows. So should a fire alarm go off during the event, you're requested to immediately make your way calmly to the nearest fire exit and vacate the building without delay. There are 2 fire exits from the Woodkey venue, back up the main stairs the way you originally came in, or out the courtyard fire door to my left. And to get out, you need to press the white release button on the right to open the gate. Just in terms of housekeeping, please don't leave empty cups and saucers on the floor, just for health and safety, and bring them back into the catering tables at the back of the room afterwards, but that's for later on. So without further ado, I'd like to just, as I said, I welcome you all. This is our 8th annual Viking event in the Dublin Festival of History, and it's always really, really well attended, and we're always so pleased to see so many of you here. This will be live streamed, and so hello and welcome to all those people who are joining us live via our YouTube link. We're also going to put the seminar online on YouTube with transcription in a couple of weeks' time as well, so you can watch out for that. And that should be on the Dublin Festival of History webpage. So Irish-Norse relations in the Viking Age shaped the city of Dublin that we live and work in today, physically and culturally. And we still have a surprising amount of heritage in common with our Scandinavian counterparts. New discoveries, the application of cutting-edge technology, and the re-examination of gendered archaeologies of 19th and 20th century mean that Viking Studies is a very dynamic field of scholarship internationally. So really the aim of this festival event is to keep Viking Studies lit here in Dublin and Ireland, stimulate debate, share knowledge, and new approaches to archaeology and history. In Ireland, the Viking Age is a historical period and it's multidisciplinary, and hence it's always a pleasure to engage with Dr. Purcell, an Irish historian based in the NUI, and with the Norwegian Embassy to bring leading experts to us from around the Viking world. This year we're very lucky to have 2 Norwegian scholars to present their work on the theme of ships, women and weapons in the Viking Age as part of the Dublin Festival of History Programme 2025. So in terms of the running order, we have the seminar, which is going to run from approximately 10 to 12 today. We're going to have 2 papers and a short break in between, where I'm going to hand over to the other chair, Sean Duffy, who's stepping in for Emma Purcell. Sean is a Professor of Medieval Irish History and Chair of Friends Medieval Dublin. We're not going to be too strict on time. At the end of this seminar, we are going to take Q&A session for both speakers. And after that, we're going to serve a light lunch, and the catering will be in the rear of the room. So do help yourself to tea, coffee and sandwiches. And then from 12:30 onwards, we're going to be having a wine reception for the very special launch of the Friends of Medieval Dublin Volume 20. I know there's probably a lot of Friends of Medieval Dublin already here in the room or watching online. That's a really, really important publication that is delivered annually following the symposium, and it's run by Sean Duffy and his team of scholars and friends. And we're absolutely delighted to have Four Courts Press here with us today, who published the book annually, and you can see that they have their book sales there and copies of Medieval Dublin if you would like to purchase. So before we start, I'd just like to say thank you, first of all, to the Dublin Festival of History team in the Culture Company, to the Dublin City Council team in Archaeology, Conservation and Heritage, and also in the Woodkey venue, to the NUI team, Emer, Cora, Ella, Beck, and others, and particularly Pat O'Leary, the registrar, who's very supportive annually, to the Norwegian Embassy. I know Silja and Knut are here with us today. Thank you very much for your support, and the ambassador, Aslak Brun, sends his apologies. He's detained in other business in Norway, but he's with us in spirit, and we do appreciate their support. I'd also like to thank our videographer, David Knox, and his colleague, Jamie, from No Name Media, because really it makes the whole event a fantastic legacy for Dublin and for the Dublin Festival of History and for Viking scholars internationally to be able to access these papers. So that's all the preamble over. So I'd just like to now welcome our first speaker. So Christian Løchsen Rødsrud is an archaeologist based in the Directorate of Cultural Heritage, and he works in Norwegian World Heritage and international affairs related to European grants. Christian has worked in rescue excavations, and his research focus is on Iron Age settlement patterns, early urbanization processes, burial customs and rituals. In 2018, on commission from Østfold County, now Viken County, NICU, the Norwegian Institute for Cultural Heritage Research, discovered the remains of a Viking ship at Gjellestad in the district of Halden using GPR, ground-penetrating radar technology. The ship was unearthed by the Museum of Cultural History in the University of Oslo, and the remains were documented. Since 2020, Christian has been project manager for the excavation of the Gjellestad ship. He's also a researcher on the project Viking Nativity, Gjellestad Across Borders, a research project that aims to show what kind of place Gjellestad was during the Viking Age and how it became a regional power centre in the Viking world. So on behalf of all the organisers, I'm very excited to welcome Christian to give his Irish debut paper on the excavations of Gjellestad ship burial, a royal burial site and its surroundings. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Ruth, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation, thanks for the introduction, and I'll begin right away. This here is the excavation site. The find of the ship would be inside the tent there, but I just have this photo with me to show you also the largest burial mound on the site. It's called Haugen, the Gjell Mound. And I'll come back to it a little bit later. And you see all the affiliations here with the Museum of Cultural History, but it's already introduced by Ruth, so I'll skip that. I'll come into at least 4 themes during this talk. I'm gonna start off with the background for the find of the ship and the excavation, and go further into the results, finds, several events going on within the burial, looking a little bit at disturbances and ship remains, and then move on to the digitalization process that is ongoing, look into conservation and future possibilities, and round off by looking at the wider landscape on what we've done in the Viking Nativity project that was also mentioned. So here we are, Scandinavia, Northern Europe. Let's see if I can get this. I don't know which one would be the pointer, but yeah, it doesn't matter. You see the Oslo Fjord, and I'm gonna, that's where we would be situated, and if we move inside the, whoops. Was it that one? Turn off the screen. Oh, there you go.
There you go.
Yep.
Maybe not.
Yeah, I'll not use that. If we move inside the fjord, the Oslo fjord, you'll see where it's placed. The nearest city is Halden in Norway. I don't know if any of you have been there, but for Norwegian it should be a familiar place. And this is moving all the way into the site. And in this aerial photo, you should notice the Gjell Mound, as mentioned. That's the green area. I can't point to it, that's unfortunate. But and you should also look at the tree lines shaped around the stream. You can see the green trees there. And to the right you have a tentative shore level map, and today's shoreline is marked with a black dotted line, so that's further out. And the shoreline at different levels in accordance with time periods. The yellow area would be the Gjellestad field, and the red areas are burial fields in close, very close to the finds that we're going to talk about. I'm going to start off with the Gjell Mound that was in the first picture. It didn't always look as it does today. This here is a picture from the 60s. And it's a long story, actually. It was first documented by the topographer Hoff, as you can see here, calling it Gjellhøy in 1793. And then something strange happens, because when he wrote about it in 1793, he says that there were observations of sea shale within the burials, and that a sea hero in the manner of Egil Ulserk, known from the saga literature, should have been buried in this place. But for some reason this story just disappears, and when the famous Norwegian archaeologist Nick Løchsen writes about this place in 1867, he thinks it's just a nature formation. And it was surface planned in the 1920s, as you see, but then again it was rediscovered by the archaeologist Erling Johansen in 1953. He took interest in it because he asked the local farmer what this formation was. He noticed that there was something strange there, and even though archaeologists had forgotten the place, the farmer, he could clearly state that, don't you know what this is? This is a burial ground of a sea king. So Johansen, he was very convinced that there should be a ship burial inside that mound. And he also got fundings to excavate it in 1968-69. He also notices that there should be a find of a boat between the river and this mound itself, which is an interesting observation, as we shall come back to. He managed to get fundings to dig this trench, kind of ignoring health and safety that we would look at today, but that's how he did his work. And he was kind of disappointed because he really found nothing more than a couple of burnt bones and amber bead. I think this one, half an amber bead. That's it. There was no ship in the mound. And the datings he provided, they're also much earlier than the Viking ship. Well, there is a possible Viking dating in the upper layer, but mainly it seems to be from what we call the migration period in Norway. That's the between 426 and 598, as you see here. But then again, you all know what happened.
Just going to adjust the
yeah.
mic slightly, because I think the sound is...
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, not at all. It's not you. Thank you very much.
All good. Let's see. Yeah, he's dead now, but I suppose he would have been very surprised of what happened later when the ship burial was actually discovered only 100 meters away from where he searched. And why did this happen? It was actually because the the county, oh no, the municipality wanted to bring a water pipeline across the field next to this huge mound, and the county archaeologists were out and doing surveying, as you see on the photos, and there wasn't really any way across. There were remains of burials and archaeological structures everywhere, and in the end they ended up ordering this GPR study that Ruth referred to, NICU covering the area here with ground penetrating radar around the mound. And they found all of this. The huge mound is there, but as you see there's a large grave field with at least 12 burials, and also the side hides in yellow several longhouses in connection. But of course, the one thing stole all the information, and that is this burial with the ship shape, as you see here. And what you should notice on the picture, I guess, is other than the ship shape, is that long structure going into the ship there. I'll come back to that, and also the anomaly in the middle, making out a square there, because that seems to be some kind of an intrusion. When all that was known, we had to make a verification project. That happened in 2019. The museum did a trial excavation on top of the ship, and the county also did some trenches on the area around to try to find out how well preserved this site was at all. And what's good with this photo is that you also see the fjord, and in the middle of the green and yellow on the other side of the highway would have been the shoreline in the Viking Age, which we'll also come back to. This isn't so important. We're rather jumping into what the museum did in 2019. So we looked at that long line structure, linear structure, going into the ship. And what that is an old drainage pipe, unfortunately going all the way into the ship. Very unfortunate, of course, because it worsened the conditions for this ship, lowering the water level, of course, but also a good place to make a test observation of what we're actually having here. And if I move on to these pictures, we just emptied the old trench and looked at how everything looks, and to the left here you can clearly see the planking of the ship overlapping, and the lower you come, the more well preserved the wood remains would be. And in the end we came upon the only thing that was actually preserved, and this is the keel of the ship. And a cross section of it here. Very importantly, we took out a sample of the keel, and it was very important for what was to come. As you can see here, it was a very soft and spongious piece of wood. It had no original surface, and in the middle there you see very active soft rot bacteria. It's undergoing aggressive attacks, of course, partially because of the drainage, partially because the original mound had been removed also from the site. And to the right there you see in white is normal cell structure, whereas the outside is undergoing heavy attacks. And this was important because we could make the argument that this needs to be saved before it's too late. So the government funded it, and with money coming through the Directorate of Cultural Heritage where I work, and it was conducted by the museum. And then we jumped to the excavations taking place in 2020 to 21. Let's just move here. This is the excavation at different levels. And it's not so important to go through all of that, but what we did was emptying the vessel layer by layer, because what we could see is that of course, the construction had collapsed under the weight of what was used to be a huge mound on top of it, probably somewhere around 35 meters in diameter, so many tons of weight onto the ship, and perhaps the construction of the ship, which collapsed into the ship. So that had to be removed before coming down to the artifact materials and also the rivets. You see all these white markings inside the ship, that is removals of rivets, and I'll come back to why it's done in that way later. After the removal, this is what we could see. You can see the lines of rivets, of course, and you also see the strakes within the ship, but the wooden structure of the strakes or the planking had really collapsed. So what used to be 2.5 centimeter thick pieces of wood had collapsed into being just 1 or 2 millimeters today. So it's observable, but we're not able to handle it in any good way. And here's also the ship. I told you about that middle section, which could be seen as an anomaly on the GPR. We could record at least 2 disturbances, I think. One of them is probably a grave robbing, and that's why we see this intrusion into the middle of the ship. It must have taken place while there was a mound on top, and it comes in from the west and hits straight into what is the burial chamber of the ship in just the same manner as we know it from the Gjellestad and the Oseberg finds as well. And if you look at these pictures here, you can see the robbers or the disturbance, whatever you want to call it. You can see the shovel marks actually from the plunderers coming into the mound, and the matrix within the ship. You see it's very mixed, so the soil is all turned around. And we know also that a second disturbance took place in the late 1800s, which you'll see on this map. This was something that Johansen notified in 1932. The farmer said that 3 mounds were removed around 1880. That's when no laws protected the heritage, and the 3 mounds can still be seen as crop marks in the field. And if we look at the geophysics, it must clearly be these 3 large mounds that he was talking about, one of them with the ship inside. There is quite a lot of artifact materials from the Gjellestad excavation, somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 artifact record from the topsoil layers. The mound fill and the ship fill is recorded in the database. However, many of them are fragments, around 8,000 exactly, and it's a huge puzzle to try to sort out what that is, because a lot was destroyed during these disturbances, of course. But there are a few complete artifacts. We can look at some of them here. To the top left, you see what seems to be an axe, but it's actually just an imprint. So the stain was there in the soil, but the grave robbers had taken it out. I don't know if it was in the Viking Age with the first disturbance, or if it happened during the 1800s. I'm not sure, but we could see that it had been there. What was left more or less intact is the smaller artifact materials, and as you see here, there are a couple of very, very nice beads. This large amber bead there it's 4 or 5 centimeters in diameter, really huge one. There was a little cluster of smaller beads, which I'll come back to. We have this bead or spindle whorl of some kind of a stone. It's the same size as the large amber bead, and there were also some beads from the topsoil. To the lower left, you see deteriorated fittings from what we think is a chest in the same manner as known from the Oseberg, representative of one of the 8,000 iron fragments, wet stone fragments, and a shard of glass. That's a very nice one as well. We know it must be from these kind of beakers to the right, even though it was only this one shard remaining within the burial. If you look at the whetstone, that's possibly quite interesting as well, because it could come from, and we haven't sorted that out yet, but it could come from the very famous export site in eastern Norway, Eidsborg. On the other side of the fjord, you see Gjellestad in blue, while the Eidsborg quarry is marked in red there. We'll have to figure that out later in the process of post-excavations. Quite a lot of unburnt bones. Here we see remains from a horse, hip section and the back leg. There are close to 600 fragments of teeth and enamel within the burial chamber. This is perhaps the most interesting find. It's a small part, a hip roll from a halibut, but the osteologist says that this halibut must have been a huge one, 3.5 meters perhaps, so really a big fish. I don't think it means that the whole fish was in the ship, but rather it's some kind of remains from depositions of food, for example. And we know from a little bit later times that halibut could also be used as cured fish in the same manner as stockfish, actually. So perhaps that's what we're seeing here. There were also burnt bones found within the turf blocks being removed. There were human and animal remains, and interestingly, we tried to date one of those, and it turned out to be much older than the burial itself, that we know is from the Viking Age. These bones came out from the 300s AD. So actually what we believe they are remains from other burials that they used as building material when constructing the mound on top of the Viking ship. Interestingly also we found something underneath the ship. So what was that all about? Was it some kind of a ritual thing? Was it some kind of a preparation? We couldn't really understand what it was while excavating. It's now been conservated, and I still am unsure what it is. Perhaps a hoe for digging the trench to put the ship inside, or it could also look like an arm from an anchor, or is it something else? If you have suggestions, you can approach me afterwards. A little bit about the ship construction. Here is the plot of everything. We're seeing the remains of deteriorated strakes, 9 remaining per side. Remaining were also 9.3 meters of preserved keel in 4 large and several smaller parts. These are all oak. 2 fragments of floor timber was also preserved, and they seem to be from some kind of other wood. You can see it's red, different from oak, and we've now, it says probably pine, but now we've looked at it closely, and it is pine. So kind of a hybrid building construction technique there with different kinds of wood. We did also see parts of timber from the burial chamber. You could see it here. It must have been some kind of a log construction, similar again to Oseberg and Gjellestad, who has burial chambers within, and somewhere around 1,400 clinker nails rivets, some spikes that held the ships together. This was an important find. To the left, you see this very long anchor-shaped rivet found on the right side of the boat there, with 2 regular rivets on each side. And it was an important find because we could compare it to Oseberg on the right here and see what it was, because it had this anchor-shaped rove, so it's clearly holding on to the inner construction of the ship, one of the frames or the floor timbers, the lowermost part of the frame. So that made us know that this is how much is surviving of the ship, and you can see it marked in green. That's what we're having. All the things in red have been removed by plowing or disturbances. And it could be compared in this way as well. This is the Oseberg ship and how that was found. And if we make a comparison, it's a small proportion of the ship still surviving. Actually, the rest of it, it's in the topsoil, unfortunately. Sorry. So, what are the what can we say about the ship itself? Was it a ship for sailing or was it a ship for rowing? That's a question I was asked very early. The only thing we know for sure is a reconstruction of the Oseberg to the left here, and what we could see is the keel here with the preserved part in the center, and things rotted away, just being an imprint, and we could see it's T shapes. In the same manner as Oseberg and Gjellestad, so we know it's a familiar building technique, but that's really all we can see about the wooden construction. There are no remains of the rig. Does it mean that it was a rowing ship? I'm not sure actually, because things like the mast partner and the keelson that we can see from the Gjellestad to the right here, they could have been removed because they're very valuable assets and moved to another ship. The mast would also be in the way because the burial chamber is placed very centrally within the grave where the mast would have been, so it would have been in the way. It's a little bit different than the Oseberg, for example, where the burial chamber is a little bit towards the aft for the mast. So, when is it from? We were able to do dendrochronology and dating, and Aoife Daly, she's Irish even, is the dendrochronologist looking into this, and she recognized that the growth rings, they are matching a tree that was alive from 603 to 724. Now the average ring width of this oak, they're just a half a millimeter, and there is no sapwood, there is no bark, so therefore we do not know the felling date. And when you shape timbers to build a ship, you would have to cut off, of course, the outer rings, so we don't really know how much was removed. The interpretation so far is that it must have been lumbered somewhere after 732, and we've concluded that the ship must have been from the beginning of the Viking Age, the first half of it. That's what we could conclude earlier. But then the artifacts also help us a bit, because it could be quite old. After 734, as said, it could actually be from the very early Viking Age. And these beads are helpful. This is the cluster of small beads, and you should notice the white ones and the segmented gold foils one especially. And there's a little amber one in the middle as well. And very recently, this volume on Ribe was published by Søren Sindbæk, and it has a beautiful chronology of beads. And if we look at the section in red, we see that in Ribe these white beads and the gold-foiled segmented ones, they are appearing most abundantly somewhere between 780 and 830. So it's highly believable that the Gjellestad ship should be placed within that region. There is we could also say something about provenance from dendrochronology, and the closest comparisons to the Gjellestad ship. It is the Oseberg ship, and it is one of the small boats from the Gjellestad mound. This means that the ship was probably built in western Norway and buried in eastern Norway. It needs to be studied a little bit more, and hopefully if we find during the post-excavation process some more wood that could be analyzed by dendrochronology, it would be possible to narrow both the date frame and this region of where it was built at a later point, but now it's somewhere within the region in red here. So that was the excavation in 2020, but it wasn't finished with that. We had emptied the ship, taken out everything, but all the rivets are remaining, as you see on the photos. And that there's a reason for it. One of them is time. It was very time consuming to make the excavation. The other is we didn't really know how to do it, because we hit upon some difficulties that we didn't expect. The rivet's state of conservation. As you see on the photo here, it's extremely fragile or brittle. Best comparison I could make is actually excavating potato crisps. You can imagine it's very difficult. If you touch the crisps with a trowel, you'll just destroy it. So you have to figure out some kind of a way to do this without breaking the rivets. So, Norwegian name here, but we call it naglekjeven, this tool that we invented to excavate. I mean, it would be, I guess it could be translated to jaws or something, but it's just a small digger, really. So we push a plate into the ground and then grab onto the soil by this lever, and we extract a piece of soil. You can see it on the top in the middle, so that's where it's extracted, and we do this around every rivet and then pack them very solidly into this material, as you can see. And then they have been both CT scanned and also X-rayed to look inside these soil blocks. Very slow and meticulous way of doing it, but it made it possible to create a very good digital model and make everything available. We document the position, size and orientation of the rivets, and everything was measured with this mini prism, as you see in the photo, with the north arrow, name tag and 4 measure points. This allows for georeference points to facilitate the export of every CT scan into a larger three-dimensional model, as I'll show you later. The samples or the soil blocks were also conserved with something called TIAS. I'll show you later. And this conservation doesn't affect the CT scanning either. So it was also done so to ensure the possibility of returning the rivet to its original position in the ship, because we're also hoping to make some kind of visitor center on the site, and probably also making it World Heritage at some point. Now, here's a little video of how we're peeking into the models. If I can find the play button. Oh, there you go. So what we're doing is kind of making a digital excavation. So we couldn't excavate it because we would destroy it. So this is how we did each and every rivet, actually, 1,400 or more, actually, because we couldn't see all of them while excavating. And they tell us a lot of stuff as well. You can see here to the left, the degree of degradation is one thing. And as a slight color difference, you can see the original surface. We could also work a little bit on that within the digital model. We can see what kind of condition it is. The one in the middle is of course broken due to the weight of the mound on top of the ship. And we can look at constructional details, such as the one to the right, where you see where the planks had been overlapping and how thick the rivet is. That's of course of very importance. They're more or less 5 centimeters, so making each plank somewhere around 2.5. And to the right, you see how it looks after excavating. We took out the soil blocks, put plastic inside and filled it with sand, so it could be re-excavated and every soil block could be placed back within the original holes. reconstruction-wise, it's been done in several ways before. The Oseberg ship is of course special because you could recreate the model with the original planking. Then we have the Ladby ship, a Danish one, excavated in 1935, which was done in a interesting way. It's also a very interesting example for us, but because it had some kind of the same level of preservation, and it has been conserved on site. As you can see, this is a museum today, and this is perhaps what we want to create at Gjellestad as well. And at Gjellestad you could even see the wood a little bit better with new conservation methods. I'll not go further into details with that, but rather look at the large digital model here. We're zoomed into one of the rivets, and this is how they align in the ship. You can zoom further out. I guess the model speaks for itself. I don't have to comment really, but here you don't have all the pieces recorded yet, but the green ones are the ones we could see, while the blue ones are things that was underground when we took out the soil blocks. And then we could put the photogrammetry onto the model, making it even more clever in a way, move and zoom around on things and see every detail from the excavation. And if we move closer, I think you can also see what is sticking out above ground and what was under the surface while we took out the samples. So switching on and off the layers, as you see here. And this is somewhere halfway, I think. It's going to be more rivets within the model. We haven't figured out a way to do the central part of the ship yet, so it's really the sterns that's fixed at this moment. By extrapolating all the rivets from the ship and superimposing them on the photogrammetry, or even joining the two in a 3D model, allows for a much more detailed model to form the basis of a precise reconstruction. And as you can see to the right, you can zoom in on details for every nail and rivet, giving them different coloring according to function and type, measuring length, studying the angles of every piece of the puzzle in great detail. And of course, when a reconstruction should be done at some point later, we also have to be joined by some kind of a ship reconstructor, because as I said many times before, the pressure of the mound on top of the ship would have made it collapse. So it's quite flat as you see it now. When you want to make a ship reconstruction, you should work with the lines and kind of tighten it up to make it to understand what kind of vessel this was. And it also remains to be seen if it's I think it must have been sailable actually, but whether it held a sail or not, we don't know yet. So this is the conservation process. It's being treated with this thing I called TEOS before, tetraethyl orthosilicate. Too difficult to say really. It strengthens the materials. It may cause some kind of tension, but it makes these soil samples handleable. So you can manage them, turn them around. You cannot, of course, not drop them to the ground. That would be fatal. But they can be handled in a different way. And if you want, you can also go in and clean out the rivets or excavate them with a little drill, for example, through this process to see them and understand them better. And this could be done in some of the examples, for if you want to look at them physically and not just through the digital model. They everything stays in position and they give a good color reproduction. As I said, we worked with the sterns so far. The stern to the left in the photo is how it was in the field, and this is how it looked after taking all the soil blocks away. And here it has been reconstructed inside the museum. So just to visualize that it's actually possible to put it all back and make it look quite good, actually. The wood from the Gjellestad ship, many parts can be handled, or not many parts, but here are the keel parts. They're all put into these trays of water with PEG 2000, and they're going to be freeze-dried afterwards. So this material can actually be either you can do research upon it, of course, but they could also be put inside the museum as reconstructed wood. Not reconstructed, but conserved wood. There is no solution yet for the heavily decomposed wood within the center of the ship, so that's what we're working out with right now. Because this TIAS, this is very good to conserve unorganic, but we had to find a way to do both that and the organics on top in the middle of the ship. So, this is rounding up. Now we're moving into the Viking Nativity project. This is a research project that's been ongoing on the site or around the site. We've been surveying the landscape with GPR and excavations as well. So Gjellestad, the excavation site with the ship in the center. This area. But all these other fields have been surveyed now, and we see there's a lot of other finds coming out. If we look at the central burial ground at Gjellestad first, the only thing there is the Gjellhaug mound, the large one, along with 4 other mounds next to the stream in the wood. Several were, of course, found, as I said, when the ship was found in 2019, but new surveys revealed at least 15 new plowed over mounds, and it's clear that the farm building today is, of course, unfortunately, in this area in between here, so it's placed actually in the middle of the burial ground, so it's perhaps the farm today is actually hiding some secrets as well, but we know it must have been a large one, and on the image here you see several other large burial grounds up along the stream. To the left hand side of the stream, a little further to the north, is a large one. They are mostly older, actually, and to the right, up in this, to the right where it's not GPR surveyed, it's another quite large burial ground, and that one supposedly was much larger before, when it's described by older archaeologists. In between, we found many settlement remains. There are cooking pits in almost every field, but I suppose we should focus on the building material here. I think we can zoom in on it, going into this picture. That's the burial grounds again, but let's have a look. There we go. Here is one of the more central buildings that were uncovered with the GPR, noticing especially perhaps this 60 meters long building that we don't know the date of yet, but that's also something we're hoping to get data from, but it wasn't. It looks well preserved from the GPR, but when we made a trench over it, it wasn't very much remaining, unfortunately. But there are datings from many periods, so it's just a power center that's been there for many decades or centuries even, before the Vikings put the ship into the burial ground on site. And a lot of other things have been looked at also. The surroundings have also been recorded by metal detector finds. The maps shows all the finds. There is a mixtures, 87 different finds, as you can see in the table. And there are finds from the early Iron Age, but more and more into the late Iron Age with the Viking Age. And then there are several undetermined as well. But of course I've just put on a couple of highlights here. The one in the center is quite iconic, I think, but that's something from the Roman period, from around 300 AD, from one of the older mounds on the site. You have this fibula on the top there. It's more or less from the same age, from a surrounding farm. And then the three remaining ones, or well, let's do the Anglo-Saxon one, of course. First, it's quite rare in Norway. Could probably come from the British Isles, a little bit before the Viking Age, but the two last ones are typically Viking, pendant with parallels in Birka, and this other find here with Boris-style heads. Yeah, we could go into more details on it. Together with a researcher called Margrethe Simonsen, I've also looked at how different metal finds relate to the buried archaeology. And the metal finds cluster in three areas. The two first are shown here and superimposed on the settlement area to the north, and also the plowed out flattened burial mounds to the left. The northern area to the right holds several artifacts relating to daily use, like spindle whorls, a key, as well as buckles and brooches. Interestingly, however, is also that it holds some weights, coins and ingots, indicating possibly that weighing and handling of valuables also took place up there. Area number 2 is the burial ground to the left, and it contains typical artifacts that would have been plowed up from the burials, for example, brooches and pendants. And if we look further to the south, that's the interesting site to round off with, because there we have, on the other side of the stream, and what used to be the shore in the Viking period, is the third area. It's called Gjellmongen Søndre. Concentration of weights and coins next to the Viking Age shoreline indicates that trade must have been going out here. And the number of finds is so far quite low, but it's only been one detector survey. It cannot be compared to larger trade and production sites from Scandinavia like Kaupanger, Ribe or Birka, but rather something like Heimdalsjordet next to the Gjellestad mound, a well-investigated site divided into plots of land, being more seasonal in character. So I think it's something more in line of that we're seeing at Gjellestad. The remains of a more permanent trading site may have been destroyed by plowing and drainage, but so far the evidence points towards a local small-scale trading site of seasonal and more temporal character linked to a large manor at Gjellestad with a central function and connections with other regions such as those surrounding Gjellestad or further afield. And with that, I round off actually here with a comparison of the excavation from the Oseberg and our excavation in 2020. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. That was absolutely fascinating, and
I can drink.
you can have a drink. and such a challenging excavation. I think it's quite exciting to see how you kind of pioneered new methods and techniques of excavating and hopefully preserving and presenting that information. We're going to take questions after the second paper. So I'm going to pass over now to my co-chair, Professor Sean Duffy. He is, as I said, the chair of the Friends of Medieval Dublin and professor from Trinity College Dublin in medieval history. And he's kindly stepped in for Emer to chair the next paper, which is by Marianne Moen. Thank you, Sean.
She's left me in charge of the technology, which is never a good idea. Now, you probably all had questions for Christian, and if you're anything like me, by the time you get to ask them, you'll have forgotten them, unless you jot them down now. So can I ask you to do that I'm trying to locate Marianne's PowerPoint, if you have a PowerPoint.
Yes, certainly do, yes.
It's not required.
But it's the Dublin presentation,
Oh,
that one. Yeah. And then go into the slideshow.
Well, you see, I'd have got there eventually,
very
but now Marianne Moen is the head of the Department of Archaeology at the Museum of Cultural History, also in the University of Oslo. She's interested in things, objects, matters like burial practice also, but subjects like identity in the Middle Ages and gender, appropriately enough. So there isn't really anybody, I think, more appropriate for us to have with us today to discuss this particular topic. What's in a grave? Gender and identity in Viking Age burials, which seems to encapsulate her range of expertise. So I'm going to hand you over to Marianne.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Lovely. Well, I'll start with saying thank you so much for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I will also just come clean and say that I'm a terrible archaeologist. So we will now be leaving exciting site maps and things like, actual archaeological detail, and we'll be going into what I'm mostly interested in, which is the narratives that we craft from the archaeological material. So prepare to be probably a little bit confused, because I will be a little bit all over the place, but I'll try and keep on track. It is my favourite subject. I do like to start any talk by saying what a terrible archaeologist I am, but I can also say that I'm actually not that great a Viking Age researcher, because the main reason I got into the Viking Age is because it's just fantastic for feminist archaeology. So it could have been anything. It just so happened that the Vikings built really big mounds and buried lots of stuff in the ground, and there's a lot of talk about gender, so it's a very fertile field for me. So we're going to start not with the Viking Age, a little bit sort of to set the scene in understanding what we know about the past, or what we think we know about the past. Now, anybody here who's an archaeologist will have probably themselves said things like the past is a foreign country. It's something that we do like to bandy about, and I have used it myself and very often do. And the past is a foreign country, but it is a country that we create in the present. How we imagine the past and who we imagine as social actors in the past tends very much to reflect the kind of people that we are ourselves able to imagine. So, stories of Stone Age men who hunted, they're not actually based on solid and tangible empirical evidence a lot of the time. They are based on archaeological empirical material, but the stories that we craft from that are very much created in the present. We don't actually know who did the hunting most of the time, nor how it was done. And yet the stories that we do tell tend to show very much this kind of image. We've got some men returning from the hunt. We've got some women minding children and cooking. They tend to stay near the campfire. But this is not actually what the archaeological material tells us, because the archaeological material doesn't tell us who did what. So what I'm very interested in is how we get from that stone axe that we find into that image. And that is obviously because that's what seems natural to us. Those are the stories that make sense to us culturally. And that is how we see gender in today's world, and those are the, the recent historical realities in which we live. Where there are animals, there'll be men to hunt them, and where there are children, there'll be women to mind them. It's very much what we're used to. So when we're presented with archaeological knowledge, I think it's very important to first and foremost ask how it is that we know what we know, or what we think we know, for that matter. How do we get from that simple stone axe into that complicated social picture? So that's enough about stone axes. This is not a talk about stone axes, I promise. I just think it's a really good example of the interpretative leaps that we need to make as archaeologists in order to create these vivid social vistas that we tend to present both to the public and to each other. So we will move from there into the Viking Age. Now, by and by. Graves are obviously very important archaeological contexts. They are my favorite context. They are the most vividly preserved images of the past that we can get. They are purposeful deposits. They are made to speak about somebody who was deceased. There's a lot you can do with a grave. What sort of information that we draw from them, however, is again contextualized in the present. That said, there is a lot of information. We have our grave goods that we can, we used to recreate identities. We have things like external constructions, mound buildings. We tend to tell stories of power and status and use and placement in the landscape. We have the internal structures. In the Viking Age, for instance, there's chamber graves that tend to be interpreted as high status. They're differentiated from, your simple soil graves. We use them to tell stories of different social lives in many ways. You've also got body treatment. Nobody's ever been able to come up with a good explanation as to why some people were cremated and some were inhumated in the Viking Age in Norway, for instance. They tend to be buried next to each other. Sometimes they were even buried in the same grave with cremations and inhumations. So, these are stories that we can't quite get our hands on, but you can see that something was going on that would be quite interesting. We also have the skeletal remains, obviously, that we can use now to use quite refined methods and tell quite complicated stories of nutrition and lives lived and travel and all of that. So, all of these things sound very reasonable, really, that the ways in which people buried their dead tell us something about who they were. But it is very much a relative truth, and again, it's something that every archaeologist here will be familiar with. Anything we find in burials need to be interpreted. That's the first question. And the people who do that interpretation is us in the modern world. But then also, there is the question of who buries the dead and what identity is it that we are looking at. Is it the deceased or is it, the mourners? There are a lot of things that play into it, how a grave is created. I've added on one of my favourite quotes in the whole wide world here about Hugh Haynans, who died lately near Cowstoke in their Weston-super-Mare, and by his own desire, he was buried in his first wife's wedding gown, which makes me question how his second wife felt about it, which was an old-fashioned light chintz, printed cotton, sounds lovely, and by his own request also his wife's linsey apron. We don't know if that was the second or first wife's. Hopefully the second, otherwise I think she would have reason to feel a bit miffed. That tells us something about burial customs potentially being really complicated. We cannot simply exhume a grave, look at a sword, and go, this is a warrior. And yet that's what we do, unless the grave happens to be female, which I will be getting back to. Sorry. So, I've added on some pictures here of typical grave goods. And they are also typically gendered grave goods. We'll be returning to that later, but beads found in graves, for instance, usually speaks to a female gender, at least in traditional archaeological gendering. There's a trefoil brooch up there, and seeing as weapons is on the agenda here as well, it's interesting to note that that's a very common form of third brooch in female burials, but it's actually a form taken from Carolingian sword belts. So it's directly imported in the early stages and then eventually copied and made locally, but it still speaks to quite an interesting martial symbolic language there. So, And also there's a traditional weapon grave here on that side. That would be typically gendered male. It's got a full weapon set. It's quite a rich grave as well. So, right. From there, I think we'll move a little bit into more specific Viking Age stories. So, the Viking Age and how we imagine it is quite a fixed story. Now, one of the disclaimers I should have added at the start of this talk is that none of what I talk about is actually very groundbreaking, because this is stuff that feminist archaeologists have been saying for 30, 40 years, and yet we're still in a situation where stories are produced that sort of reproduce the very traditional stories and doesn't take into account what the more nuanced gender things. So there are many different versions of the Viking Age, and I think that's quite important to note, first of all. It really depends on where you are. The Norwegian Viking Age is different from the Danish Viking Age, and the Danish Viking Age is different from the Finnish Viking Age, who actually did have a Viking Age, contrary to popular opinion. And again, that's very different from the Irish Viking Age. It is heritage in motion. It's heritage that's constantly being reproduced in different places. Now, in Norway, for instance, the Viking Age was integral to creating national identities. And it is quite important to have that in mind when you research the Viking Age in Norway. So Norway was not independent until 1905. Up until then, we were in a union with Sweden. And in 1904, the Ulsberg ship burial was excavated. And when that was excavated, there was an explicit agenda to use the ship burials to create a national story of unity so that people had something to be proud of. Norway had not been independent for a good 500 years at that stage. 400? 500? 500. So we really needed these symbols of national pride. And it's become part of the sort of national identity. We trade on it, we barter on it, we use it in our branding, but it also is part of the stories that we're told about who we are, where we come from. This is our story of the Viking Age. And that, I think, is quite important. So, moving from there into the stories of the Viking Age, there is sort of the official version of the Viking Age. So, it was a time of hierarchies, we say. It was a time of chieftains and petty kings, a time when power was consolidated into larger power structures. It was a time that was dominated by free farmers and landowners. There were raiders and traders, obviously, and there were a lot of warriors in these stories. The Vikings travelled, and they were very accomplished craftspeople and traders. What we tend to hear less about are things like the poor, the dispossessed, and slaves, although that is changing in recent research, but still, not a big part of the stories that you see in museums. But through all of this, there is a very strong belief that it was also a deeply patriarchal society, and that being born a woman was being born less fortunate than being born a man. Gender roles in the envisaged Viking Age are very much clear-cut. They are very binary. You're either male or you're female. And so the rest of this talk will be spent picking apart these stories to a certain degree. There is also an overarching belief that men were in charge, and you will read that in most accounts of the Viking Age, that there would be a male head of the household and decisions were up to them. That is quite difficult to challenge, but I think if you look at the material, that becomes slightly easier. So most activities in the Viking Age are described as default male. You have, men travelling. The men are farming, they're trading, they're crafting, and they're generally leading society. Women, if they're described at all, they are described as looking after the house. You have this very embedded story of innanstocks and utanstocks in the Viking Age, where women are given charge of anything inside the threshold, and then men get the whole world, which is awesome for them. It doesn't hold up, but we'll get back to that. So, what I have, I've put on one of the enduringly excellent examples of these traditional stories in the Viking Age. This is actually taken from the current webpage. This is not 1958 or anything like that. This is the current webpage of the National Museum of Denmark, where they will tell you that the majority of women in the Viking period were housewives, like I said, staying within the house, managed housekeeping, all of that. Possible there were female entrepreneurs who worked in textile production, so that's very kind of them. But, as you'll have probably read by now, it does have one of my favourite quotes. Just like today, women in the Viking period sought a suitable partner, and the sagas are filled with stories of women competing over who has the best man. Am I right, ladies? It is what we care about. And, this is a bit of a problem, because this is cultural heritage promoted today. It's also interesting, at least if you share my rather niche interest, you can go into the National Museum's webpage, and you can have a look at like the drop-down menus and learn about other parts of society, and it's really interesting. So it's got headings such as society, and it's like leaders, warriors, traders, women. Now, Denmark doesn't really do feminism, or women, allegedly, which is interesting. Right. We will move on from here, bearing that in mind, and we'll start looking a little bit at the material. So, what are the sources that we use to tell this particular story of the Viking Age? Now, we have our archaeological material, obviously, graves, which we will be coming back to once I've talked a bit more fluff. Burials, cemeteries, buildings, farms, farming, towns, harbours, all of these things help craft our stories. But again, those places are only populated by the interpretations that we make ourselves. So in all of these archaeological contexts, we obviously find a lot of objects. We find weapons and jewellery and tools of trade and tools of crafts, remains of animals and traces of subsistence farming and skeletal remains, all of those things. And you can use those remains to tell different stories, which is obviously where we're going to go with this. We also have written sources, obviously. Not a lot of contemporary sources, and the ones that are very rarely very descriptive, and if they are, they're written very much from outsiders' perspectives. Runestones are fascinating. We don't have a lot of them in Norway, and even so, they don't tell us an awful lot about social organisation. So, they're not. I don't find them that helpful, but I'm also not a runologist, so there is that. Later stories get more complicated. Sagas I don't like to use. They are written several hundred years later and exclusively by Christian men for Christian men, so I don't think that they're going to give me really what I'm looking for. And what is interesting is to look at that story of the Viking Age that we have and then start really delving into the different source categories and seeing if things tally up. So, does the material support those typical stories? And obviously, I wouldn't be here if I thought that it did. But let's take a look at some examples. Now, there are regional differences. I was saying earlier that the heritage stories of the Viking Age differ from place to place, but also the material differs from place to place. Norwegian burial material can't be compared to the Danish burial material, for instance, counting the overarching stories, but once you delve into it, it really is quite different. So the Norwegian burial material tends to be much richer. We have a lot more grave goods. It is a lot more visible. The Danish material is better on skeletal preservation, but not a lot of grave goods. And that speaks to regional differences in burial practices. But if you look at the overarching trends, whatever sample you have is not going to be representative. So we don't actually have a full and complete overview of the corpus of Norwegian graves from the Viking Age, but the most recent workable estimate is about 8,000 graves. Now, that's not a lot over a period of about 300 years. So you're looking at a very small population sample here. We also don't have a lot of skeletal material, which poses some questions when you're looking at identity. So, you need to ask, where are all the other people buried? Were they not buried at all, or were they buried in ways that we don't find? Were they, cremations that were scattered? We just don't know. We can only work from what we have, but it is important to bear in mind that that is a small sample. And in Norway, it is pretty much exclusively high-status graves that we have. A few examples of ones that might have been lower social classes, but not many. But, from that story, we still get a very clear-cut sort of image of known gender and identity. And we do tend to be told that the material supports that. So it's interesting to start looking into how that actually works. Now, I will be coming back to this, but there are some really interesting things, like the control material for how we gender graves, for instance, in Norway, because, as I said, we don't have the skeletal material, which poses a question as to how we can securely gender a grave, because most of the time there is no body. So we look at the object and we end up doing what we like to call sexing metal. And so we tell a story about female identities from things like keys. Keys are commonly found in male graves as well, but that's by the by. I'll be getting back to that. So there are some really big challenges with the material here. Oh no, there should have been a picture here. Oh, there it is. Lovely. That's not coming out very well. But we heard earlier about the Ulsberg ship, which is obviously really fascinating. Excavated in 1904, it's absolutely unique in many ways. But what's really interesting is looking at it from a gendered perspective. So Ulsberg is the wealthiest grave known from the Viking Age, I think it's safe to say. Massive ship burial, massive mound, excellent preservation, and the burial of 2 women. So when you compare that to other ship burials, that's where it gets really interesting. So 20 kilometres down the road is Gjellestad, and Gjellestad is the Gjellestad chieftain. Everybody knows that. He was a big man. He has wounds that indicate that he might have fallen in battle. Big, sturdy, definitely chieftain. But the Ulsberg women are who were the Ulsberg women, and how can we explain them? And there are many different explanations, but very few people who suggest that one of them or both of them could have been a chieftain. And I think that really speaks into the whole narrative of how gender plays into what we tend to see when it comes to the Viking Age. So, some of the explanations for Ulsberg are quite interesting. Ritual power is one. It's quite a popular way of interpreting female remains in the Viking Age, is to go that, well, obviously they had a ritual function, because it sort of neatly removes them from the sphere of power and politics and all of the things that we think that women couldn't be part of. There was a study done in the 90s, for instance, that looked at the landscape and decided that Ulsberg's placement was anti-monumental, as opposed to the other mounds that are very much comparable that author thought were monumental. Now that is really interesting, because if you look at the landscape, it's pretty much exactly in the similar place, similar setup as the Gjellestad mound. But, you know, that same author talked about Gjellestad as a symbol of power and Ulsberg as a ritual sacrifice. Other explanations have gone into things like that it might have been a bride sent over from Denmark with her dowry, which is interesting. That, you know, there is a story there that needs challenging on many levels. This young bride, as she is referred to, wouldn't have been so young, seeing as one of the women is aged 50 and the other one 80. Now, nothing wrong with that, but, you know, I don't really see it matching the whole young lady sent with a lovely ship and dowry. Another explanation has taken it even further and suggested that there must have been a man there, but that he has somehow disappeared. And it is true the ship was broken into, but there is nothing to indicate that there was a male body in there at any point in time. Having said that, that same scholar, I will name no names, but some of you might know, also suggested that in the Birke warrior grave BJ581, which I will talk about in a minute, there must have also been a man, so there is a bit of a pattern here to those explanations. So yeah, you know, you get explanations such as religious sacrifice, a missing man, an important wife or mother of a Viking. What you don't get is any sort of story where the women are accorded agency in their own right. And that very much runs through the stories that we tend to tell about the Viking Age, where women tend to be accessories to male action. And again, obviously, to me, and to many other people, the reason that we treat this burial differently is because of the gender of the person buried. But to me, again, it is important to recognise that the gender of the person buried matters to my interpretation, not to the way in which this person was buried. So we are here crafting a story very much situated in the present to try and interpret something that, if you look at the material and take gender out of the equation, tells us a very different story. Now, Ulsberg is not the only example. Obviously, there are many. I can talk a little bit about that image up on the screen. That's rather a famous boat burial from the Viking Age town of Kaupang in Norway. It's got the catchy name KA294-296. Yeah, excellent name. That is a triple burial, potentially actually more people, but it's very difficult to interpret because the skeletal preservation is quite poor there. What we do know for certain is that there is a female body in one part, a female body in both ends of the boat, the stern and the thank you. And there's a male body in the middle. Now, some of the stories crafted from this have spoken about the ritual connotations of the lady who's seated there in the back of the boat. She does have some indicators that she might have had a ritual role, but they're not overwhelming. So a lot of the interpretations, like I say, played a lot on that, and one even fielded the suggestion that this was a married couple buried with their sorceress who was sacrificed to accompany them. Note the married couple, because that, again, makes sense to us, and the sorceress who was sacrificed. But there is several problems with this, not least of which is that if you trawl through the excavation notes, which I have done, because sometimes I struggle with what to do with my free time, if you trawl through the original excavation notes, you will see that the excavators thought that the two women were buried first and that the man was a later addition. There's also some question about the direction of the lady who's lying down. That is the reconstruction drawing that myself and Neil Price and Ian Pedersen commissioned a few years ago, and it tells a different story than previous reconstructions where her head was facing that of the man, which again talks into that whole lovely binary married couple story. That's based on the original excavation drawings. We can't be 100% certain. It is a possibility that they had the north arrow pointing the wrong way on that drawing, but we think that's how it originally was. It is with a caveat of it was a very difficult excavation. But that again changes that whole narrative of, you know, the married couple buried lovingly together. It just proves that it's usually very much worthwhile examining the evidence very carefully. The other thing is, if you again go back to the original excavation notes, it will tell you that they had no idea who the shields and the weaponry belonged to, but they put it under the man's belongings because that made most sense. But there's no way of finding out because it's very difficult to find out where it originally was placed. But again, you know, that's very interesting. Overall, as well, you can go into, you know, single burials and start deconstructing the stories told. But you can also look at more sort of regional patterns. And there's a story that's quite stubbornly embedded in archaeology, that we have fewer female graves than we have male graves, for instance, from the Viking Age. That's not true. I would just like to go out and say that. Some places it is true, other places it is not. Birka, the Swedish Viking Age town, has more female burials than male burials. If you look in Norway, yes, there are more known male burials than female burials, but then also we have no osteological material. So you have no quality control. In Denmark, it's 50-50, like you would expect from any given population. So those are things that you also need to really look at how those narratives are crafted. So if we look a little bit more at narratives, there are many examples that graves are not necessarily gender dependent when it comes to wealth and status. Not only do we not have fewer female graves, there is also no indication that female graves tend to be less wealthy. But there is a very strongly embedded tradition of talking about female graves and male graves very differently. Now, 2002 is a little while ago, but I'm getting to the age where, you know, I don't know if things happened last year or if it happened 10 years ago. So I still think that's a relevant reference to use. And it also talks about how we tend to craft our interpretations. So as early as 1991, an archaeologist called Anna Starsberg examined trading equipment, and she found that it was perfectly normal to find in female graves. In some places, like at Birka, which I just mentioned, it's actually more common in female graves than it is in male graves, and yet the story goes that women did not trade. As Christiansen would tell you, in 2002, many women were buried with pairs of scales, not because they had been traders, because no, but because they were good housewives. Now, that begs the question, if a pair of scales means something in a female grave than it does in a male grave, how do we know that? Who told us that? It's obviously because to us, that makes sense, and it fits into the story that we think we know, and that is quite important and difficult to get past. We also have lovely examples such as Jon Vidar Sigurdsson, who tells us that the role of women in the settlement of Iceland was very important because they took care of the food. Now, there is no indication to say that women took care of food more than men did. In my PhD research, I looked at a sample of just over 200 graves from Vestfold, and cooking equipment was more common in male grave than it was in female graves. And the same actually applies across the board in Norway. So these are stories that we tell because they fit with the story of the Viking Age that we have sort of worked within for years and years and years. But they can be challenged. Same goes for keys. Written stories will tell you that when a woman married, she was given a bunch of keys, and that was a symbol of her status as a housewife. For years, archaeologists went, and yes, and you can see that because you find keys in female graves, which you certainly do, but you find them as often in male graves as well. So again, we need to look at the archaeology before we assume that it backs up these very traditional stories of gender roles. Yeah, I haven't talked a lot about weapons today, nor will I, but it is worth putting in Bidker BJ 581, which I'm sure you're all relatively familiar with, most people are by now. That's an excellent example, not necessarily because it tells us about female warriors, it does that as well, but because it tells us something about how we relate to the Viking Age when the archaeology doesn't fit with what we think we know. Now, BJ 581 was excavated a very long time ago, about 150 years. At the time, it was labelled as a male warrior, and it was left at that. In the 1970s, somebody looked at the skeletal material and went, hang on, I think this is a woman, but it wasn't published and nothing was done with it. And then in 2015, I think, Anna Gjellestad and her team did an ADNA analysis, and it was published in 2017, and it is indeed a female body, buried with a full set of weapons. Now, we don't have a lot of women buried with weapons in the Viking Age, but we do have enough to know that it definitely did happen. We also have iconography and we have written sources, so we know that women could and did use women in the Viking Age, or at least I know that, but not everybody agrees. It is still a very contentious debate. But what's really interesting about Bidker is the way that many people reacted, because it did sort of split the academic community in really interesting ways. And if you really look at many of the responses, what they will tell you is that this can't be because it doesn't fit what we think we know. At which point you have to go, but that's not sound archaeology, is it? This is indisputable. It is a female body, it's buried with weapons. When you have to twist the narrative so that it fits what you think you know about the Viking Age, I think we have a problem with the way in which we craft our narratives. Some stories suggested that this was a female slave, sacrificed instead of her master. Some suggested that it was a lady buried with her husband's weaponry instead of her own stuff. Who knows why that would happen? But there was a general reluctance to look at it and go, hang on, what we think we know about the Viking Age might be wrong. And that to me tells us again something about how embedded those gendered stories are in how we tend to view the Viking Age and the past in general. Now, for a gender archaeologist, I've actually started to think that we have a problem with our sort of overwhelming need to gender graves. I'm not sure that we're doing ourselves any favours, really. Because in the modern world, gender is one of the primary identifiers. From before the day you're born, your gender matters. When I was pregnant with my son, everybody was like, oh, is it a boy or a girl? And I'd be like, I hope it's human. I don't actually know what the gender is. When you fill out a passport application, you have to tick a box. Where do you belong? Which camp do you belong? But those are our standards. And if you look at the burial evidence from the Viking Age, I'm not sure that they were their standards. Now, you have different ways of gendering, of course, but they all come back to this need to compartmentalise and divide the population into two neat segments. And I think that really disregards a lot of other ways of thinking about identities, and that we could be looking at things like status and age and all of the things that come in, second to us from gender. So when it comes to the Viking Age in Norway, we tend to gender from grave goods, like I said. And then we have this control material that we use for it. But there is some shortcomings with that because, hang on, let me just make sure that I'm not losing track. Yeah, there are several shortcomings with that, and I'll sort of look at a few of them. So one of the things is that when you're looking at Viking Age graves in Norway, we say that weapons indicate a man, and textile equipment and jewelry indicate a woman. And that is, to a certain degree, true. It's not untrue, I'll say that much. But what we then don't talk about is all the things that these people also have in common. So if you start to take away the weapons and the jewelry, you will see that they have cooking equipment, there are sacrificed animals, there is household goods, there are, farming equipment. All of that, to me, tells a story of shared identities. But instead, we look at the weapons and we look at the jewelry and we put them in two separate camps and split them from each other instead of looking at all the things that they might have had in common. But like I said, it is a partial story. It's not untrue, but it is also not completely true. because a good percentage of most cemeteries will contain what we call ungendered graves. So that in the sample that I have worked with most, 25% of graves can't be gendered. In Danish cemeteries, for instance, up to 50% of graves can often not be gendered, which tells us that we have crafted this story that people communicated their gender in very fixed ways in the Viking Age on a very partial story. Like I say, it's not untrue, but it also isn't quite true. And it's those ungendered graves that I've gotten quite interested in most recently, because we do have to think, what is it that makes them ungendered? Now, obviously, a lot of people have asked, but surely they're just poorer, and they're not necessarily. They can be very high status. For instance, Ulsberg, it does have textile equipment, but it doesn't have a single brooch. So again, that's a grave that could be, in a way, passed as ungendered. And obviously, it is osteologically assessed as women. And then also the control material that we tend to use is actually, the most commonly used one is the 1984 publication called Iron Age Man in Denmark, which is a really comprehensive study of osteological material and grave goods. And it is true, the story that we tell from that yes, osteologically assessed women tend to be buried, when they are buried at all, with grave goods, with things like oval brooches, and osteologically assessed men are buried with swords. But it's a study of about 380, I think, skeletal remains, and under 20 of them have grave goods. So again, we've crafted this story that yes, it fits. Oval brooches are women, swords are men, but it fits in a tiny, tiny percentage, and lots of people are buried in different ways. And those people we tend to really not include in the stories that we tell. Which makes me wonder if we've gotten it a little bit wrong when it comes to gender in the Viking Age. So, I think I'll be moving towards the end with one of my favourite pictures. Anybody who's seen me talk before will have probably seen this before, because I think it speaks to the Viking Age that we have reconstructed that doesn't quite fit with the archaeological material. It also doesn't quite fit with a sustainable population. Now, this is an image from a 2004 popular publication on the Kerkbang excavation, and it's a reconstruction of a perfectly normal day in a perfectly normal town. It's just not a very sustainable town. It's 47 men in that image and 7 women. There are as many seagulls as there are women. This is the Viking Age as it is represented. There are also hardly any children. I mean, there's a lot of problems. But what's also interesting is that the men and the women are instantly recognizable, because the women are wearing these dresses with oval brooches and the men are wearing their trousers. But actually, we don't know if that was a general rule. Oval brooches aren't actually as common as people would have you believe when it comes to the Viking Age. Many, many graves are buried without oval brooches, and they are less and less common as the Viking Age wears on. So we've sort of crafted this very stereotypical image that we think we know, and it just isn't there in the archaeology. Which is interesting. Now, I will wrap up by sort of tying this back to some old research. Like I said, none of my research is that groundbreaking, because these are all things that have been done by people before me. Elisabeth Admin Nordblad's thesis, which unfortunately is written in Swedish, was published in 1998, where she shows how the Victorian ideals of early archaeologists have painted the picture of the Viking Age as we know it. Now, early Victorian archaeologists obviously were men, they were middle class, and their women stayed at home and their children were invisible. I think you can still see that in this picture, that still dominates the stories that we tell. So, graves do tell us a lot, but what they tell us depend on who's listening, and it also depends on how we interpret the material that we find. And we can't interpret things outside our own cultural frameworks, but also we must always be aware of those cultural frameworks and what it is that it does to the ways in which we see the world. Now, people have often asked me if I think that women were powerful in the past because I'm a feminist, and yes, that's probably true, but you can turn that on its head and you can go, why do you think that women weren't powerful in the past, and what is your particular political persuasion? Because it will influence how you see the material in the ground. A knife in the ground doesn't tell us a story until we've lifted it up and interpreted it. And I think that's something that we really need to bear in mind. And when it comes to the Viking Age, I think we really need to scrutinise it. Yeah, I think that's it.
that was. Thanks for that wonderful corrective, I suppose. And,